Captain Thane Asher was not a man who scared easily, but even he had to admit, standing in the teleportation hub of Gloxia Prime, that his stomach felt like it was doing the cha-cha with an overcaffeinated hamster. The place was a buzz of alien tech and questionable safety standards, and he couldn't help but wonder how many regulations had been bent, folded, or downright spindled to get this place operational. "Welcome to Gloxia Prime," a voice chirped over the intercom, cheerful as a chipper funeral director, "where you'll never lose your luggage because you'll never arrive." Thane let out a short bark of a laugh, drawing sidelong glances from the mishmash of sentient beings bustling around him. "Gotta love a place with a sense of humor," he muttered. A snort came from his left, where he just noticed a diminutive Technicolor alien tinkering with a panel that looked suspiciously like it shouldn't be smoking. "You think that's funny? Wait until you see what happens when Zala gets creative with the power grid," the alien said, not looking up. "Zala Nisk," she added, as if introducing herself to a dinner party, engineer part-time pyromaniac. Thane grinned. "Thane Asher, full-time idiot for coming here, apparently." Zala snapped something that looked like a combination of a wrench and a whisk back into her toolkit with a flourish. "You're not wrong. So, what brings a human to this charming slice of technological purgatory?" "Curiosity and a death wish," Thane replied, eyeing the sparking wires with a practiced nonchalance. "I heard you folks have some newfangled dimension-hopping tech. Thought I'd see it for myself." "Ah, yes," Zala said, her voice dripping with the kind of irony normally reserved for tragic poetry and political promises. "The wonder of science that makes you question your life choices. It's been acting up." Like a teenager with interdimensional angst, she gestured for Thane to follow her down a corridor that threatened to outdo a funhouse for weird angles and odd lighting. "This place always like this? Or did I arrive during a particularly exciting time of malfunction?" Thane asked, sidestepping what he hoped was just a puddle of coolant. "Depends on your definition of exciting," Zala said. "Ever since we got this teleportation hub online, it's been a carnival of chaos, and not the fun kind with candy floss and overpriced rides. More the kind where everything spontaneously combusts and no one wants to admit they forgot the fire extinguisher." Thane nodded, his brain doing mental gymnastics to keep up with the colorful barrage of stimuli. "Sounds like my last vacation. Oh, you'll love it." Today we had a maintenance drone start quoting Vagon poetry while it dismantled a crucial safety mechanism. Which, when you think about it, is less illogical than it sounds. Is there a particular reason why everything here seems to want to turn into a scene from a disaster movie? Thane asked as they reached a room filled with blinking lights and consoles that looked like they'd been designed by a hyperactive child, left alone with crayons and a blueprint. "You mean besides the fact it's built on Gloxia Prime?" Zala asked, raising one eyebrow as if that explained everything. "The tech is cutting edge, but the issues are bleeding edge. We're talking quantum fluctuations, dimension leaks. It's like trying to juggle angry cats with chainsaws for paws." "Sounds like an operation," Thane said, nodding sagely. "And what exactly does this miracle of modern machinery do when it's not having a meltdown?" "According to the optimistic marketing brochure, it bridges dimensions. Allows us to hop between worlds like a stone across a pond," Zala said, her hands dancing over a console like a conductor coaxing a symphony from chaos. "In reality, it's more like throwing a rock at a window and hoping it doesn't bounce back and hit you in the face." "Charming. And what happens when it does hit you in the face?" "Oh, you know," Zala said with a shrug, "explosions, implosions, the occasional accidental vacation to somewhere with more teeth than you'd like." "But it's all part of the fun." Thane chuckled, though he had the sinking feeling he might soon be regretting his career choices. "Something tells me you and I are going to get along just fine, Zala." "You say that now," Zala said, her eyes gleaming with mischief or madness, possibly both. "But wait until you've been through a dimension jump gone haywire. It's like being drunk, but the hangover starts immediately and it's existential." She flipped a switch and a low hum filled the air, throbbing with potential energy and the promise of imminent disaster. "This monstrosity," she continued, patting the console with something like affection, "is the heart of the operation. When it's working, it's pretty much the universe's worst-kept secret. When it's not, well, you're better off not asking." "I take it you've had your fair share of close calls then," Thane said, leaning against a nearby console that was, thankfully, not sparking. "Close calls are what passes for routine around here," Zala said, suddenly serious. "Thing is, the system's been glitching more than usual lately. I can't pin down why, but it's like it's developing a mind of its own. And a nasty sense of humor to boot." Thane crossed his arms, finding himself genuinely intrigued despite, or perhaps because of, the potential for catastrophe. "So, what's our first step, fearless leader?" Zala grinned, a wicked flash of teeth. "First, we figure out why this thing's acting like it's possessed by the ghost of bad decisions. Then if we're lucky, we don't end up as interdimensional roadkill." Thane chuckled, a low rumble of sound that matched the hum of the machinery around them. "Sounds like a plan. Let's hope luck's on our side." As they dove into the mess of wires and code, Thane couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. It wasn't just about the tech or the adventure or even the danger. It was about the challenge, the puzzle of it all. And if it all went wrong, well, at least he'd go out with a bang, or several, if Zala's track record was anything to go by. They worked side by side, synchronizing like a well-oiled machine, but one that occasionally spat out bolts and cursed in alien tongues. There was a strange kind of camaraderie in flirting with disaster, in daring the universe to do its worst and smugly surviving to tell the tale. Thane found himself enjoying Zala's company more than he'd expected. She was sharp and irreverent, with a wit as quick as her hands, and while he'd never admitted out loud, he appreciated the way her mind seemed to twist and turn, always a step ahead or a step to the side, dodging the obvious solutions in favor of the clever ones. Iors slipped away in a blur of activity. "So," Zala said, breaking the companionable silence that had settled over them, "why'd you really come here, Thane?" "Curiosity," he answered, glancing at her sideways. "And maybe I wanted to see if there was still a place in the universe that could surprise me." "And have we?" Thane thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, you have." "Good," Zala said, returning her attention to the console with renewed focus. "Now let's make sure this place doesn't end up as a footnote in the annals of interdimensional disaster." Just as the words left her mouth, a warning klaxon blared, echoing through the cavernous space with all the subtlety of a rampaging rhino. "Looks like the universe heard you," Thane quipped, though his fingers were already flying over the controls, trying to assess the damage. "Oh, it's just getting started," Zala said, her voice grim but laced with adrenaline-fueled excitement. "Hold on to your metaphorical hats, Captain. This ride's about to get bumpy." Thane could feel the machinery beneath his hands vibrating with a life of its own, the hum now a roar, a tidal wave of energy building to a crescendo. "Any chance this is part of the standard operating procedure?" "If by standard you mean imminent breakdown, then yes," Zala shot back, her hands moving as if they were extensions of her will. "We're in for a world of hurt and not the fun kind." "I've always been partial to the fun kind," Thane said through gritted teeth, trying to keep things from spiraling out of control. "Well, stick around," Zala replied, her eyes alight with determination. "I guarantee you'll never use the word board again." The room was a cacophony of noise and flashing lights, each alarm a discordant symphony blaring its own unique brand of panic. Thane could feel the pull of reality stretching, like a rubber band on the verge of snapping, threatening to fling them into the unknown. "Here goes nothing," Zala muttered, slamming a fist down on a big red button that seemed to pulse with ominous intent. "And everything," Thane added, half to himself, half to the universe. There was a sudden lurch like the entire cosmos had hiccuped, and for one heart-stopping moment everything hung in the balance. Then, with a bone-rattling shudder, the world snapped back into focus. The lights flickered, the alarms died to a dull buzz, and the hum of the machinery settled into a steady, purring cadence. "We good?" Thane asked, straightening with the cautious optimism of a man not quite willing to believe his luck. "For now," Zala said, looking more relieved than she'd probably ever admit. "Let's hope it stays that way." Thane let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, glancing around the room as if seeing it anew. "You know," Zala said, her voice back to its usual sardonic lilt, "for a moment there I really thought we were going to end up as cosmic debris." Thane chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, me too. Guess the universe isn't done with us yet." "Lucky us," Zala said, sharing a grin that felt like a promise of more chaos to come. And as Thane looked at the mess of technology and potential around them, he found he didn't mind the thought one bit. After all, what was life without a little insanity? As long as you lived to tell the tale. Thane Asher was starting to think his life was less of an adventure and more of an extended exercise in poor judgment. A few hours ago, he'd been tinkering with a teleportation hub that had all the stability of a toddler on a sugar high. Now, he was hunting down gremlins, or gremlin-like mysteries, in its electronic entrails. And the gremlins had company, encrypted messages that hinted at something big, ugly, and suspiciously like a conspiracy. Encrypted messages? Seriously? Thane muttered, scrolling through lines of code that seemed to mock him with their complexity. He half expected them to start spelling out insults in Morse code. It's like someone's trying to show off how clever they are, or screw with us. Or both. Zalanisk peered over his shoulder, her expression a blend of curiosity and the kind of amusement that usually preceded disaster. Encrypted. Someone's got a flair for dramatics. What do you think? Sabotage? Or just a really dedicated prankster? Could be both. Maybe some desk jockey decided to spice things up during their lunch break. Or maybe we're about to uncover the universe's worst-kept secret. Thane leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Either way, it's a headache I didn't ask for." Zala cracked her knuckles, a grin spreading across her face that promised trouble. "Let me have a crack at it. I've got a way with codes. And by way, I mean I'm stubborn enough to keep poking at it until it gives up." Thane gestured to the console, leaning back to watch her work. "Be my guest. Just try not to accidentally trigger any self-destruct sequences. I'd like to keep my atoms intact." Zala laughed, a short, sharp sound. "No promises. But hey, if we do explode, at least it'll be in the name of science." As Zala attacked the encryption with the tenacity of a terrier going after a particularly juicy bone, Thane couldn't help but wonder about the implications. An encrypted message buried in the hub's code was bad enough. The fact it was sophisticated enough to stump their systems meant someone with brains and resources, was pulling strings. And if they were right about the sabotage, then this wasn't just a technological hiccup. It was deliberate, malicious. "Any luck?" Thane asked after a few minutes of watching Zala work her magic, or madness, take your pick. "Define luck," she replied, not looking up. "If you mean have I cracked the code and discovered a secret stash of interdimensional vodka, then no." She paused, typing something rapid fire. "But I've got a few threads I'm tugging on. If I can unravel it, we might have something great. Just what I always wanted, a puzzle that could kill us." Thane rubbed his temples, trying to ward off the impending headache. "You think our friends up the chain of command are in on it?" Zala hesitated, her fingers pausing over the keys. "Could be. I mean, it's not like this place is a paragon of virtue. Half the people running it couldn't organize a piss-up in a brewery. And that's on a good day, yeah, I've noticed." Thane remembered the last time he'd met with the upper echelons of Gloxia Prime's management. They'd been about as transparent as a brick wall. The question is, are they incompetent or corrupt, or both? Zala glanced at him, her gaze sharp. "You know, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But if they are involved, we're going to need more than a hunch and some scrambled messages to prove it." Thane nodded, a plan starting to form in his mind. "Agreed. Let's keep digging. If there's something rotten in the state of Gloxia, I want to know about it before it stinks up the place." They worked in silence, The only sound the soft clatter of keys and the distant hum of the hub, which for once wasn't threatening to blow them to kingdom come. Got something, Zala said suddenly, her voice triumphant. It's not much, but it's a start. What is it? Thane leaned forward, his interest piqued. Coordinates. Or at least they look like coordinates. Could just be a really bad attempt at a Sudoku puzzle. But I'm betting on the former. Coordinates to where? Zala shrugged, though she looked pleased with herself. Dunno, haven't had time to check, but I'd bet my last credit it's somewhere we're not supposed to go. Which, naturally, makes it the first place we should check out, Thane said dryly. Grab your gear. We're going on a little field trip. Zala's eyes gleamed with mischief, and she snapped a mock salute. Yes, sir. I'll pack the essentials, tools, snacks, and an unhealthy disregard for personal safety. Thane chuckled, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to dive into a particularly nasty rabbit hole. And maybe a plan. Plans are good. Plans are overrated, Zala said with breezy confidence. But sure, let's wing it. What's the worst that could happen? Don't tempt fate, Thane replied, though a part of him agreed with her. Plans had a way of going sideways, especially in a place like Galaxia Prime, where chaos was practically part of the decor. They gathered their things and headed out, leaving the relative safety of the hub behind. The corridors of Galaxia Prime were a tangled mess of wires and pipes, each intersection a potential ambush point for Danger or the janitorial staff, who were arguably more terrifying. Are we sure this is a good idea? Thane asked as they approached the teleportation bay, which had been roped off with an alarming number of red warning signs. Absolutely not. But that's never stopped us before, has it? Zala replied, her grin as sharp as a knife. The bay loomed before them, an intimidating jumble of machinery and blinking lights. It was the kind of place that made you question whether science or madness had birthed it, and whether it really mattered in the end. Here goes nothing, Thane muttered, stepping into the bay alongside Zala. You ready? As I'll ever be, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos that always seemed to accompany their escapades. With a deep breath, Thane keyed in the coordinates Zala had uncovered. The console beeped obligingly, though whether it was in agreement or amusement was anyone's guess. The air shimmered with the peculiar energy of the teleportation system, a promise of unknown destinations and unforeseen consequences. On three, Thane said, his tone more resigned than resolute. 1, 2, 3, Zala finished, slamming the activation button with a flourish that was more theatrical than necessary. The world around them dissolved in a blaze of light and sound, pulled apart and reassembled by forces that defied comprehension. For a moment, Thane felt like he was caught in a blender set to puree, his thoughts a whirl of confusion and adrenaline. Then, with a jarring thud, they landed. Well, that was fun, Zala remarked, picking herself up from the floor with practiced ease. Let's not do it again anytime soon, yeah? Agreed, Thane said, brushing himself off and taking stock of their surroundings. They were in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the smell of dust and disuse. Looks like someone's idea of a secret hideout, or a really dodgy nightclub. Let's hope it's the former. I'm not dressed for clubbing, Zala quipped, squinting at the dark interior. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, hiding secrets and surprises they'd rather not uncover. But the coordinates had led them here, and Thane wasn't about to back down now. Over here, Zala called, gesturing to a console that looked like it had seen better days, probably several decades ago. Thane joined her, peering at the screen that flickered to life under Zala's touch. Lines of code scrolled by, accompanied by schematics and diagrams that made little sense to him but seemed to excite Zala. This is it, she said, her voice tinged with awe. Blueprints for the hub but with alterations, enhancements, and not the kind you'd find in the company manuals, so it's not just malfunctioning. Someone's actually been fiddling with it. Thane asked, feeling a mix of anger and vindication. Looks like it, and not just anyone. These kinds of modifications require access and knowledge, someone high up, probably with an impressive collection of skeletons in their closet. Well, that narrows it down, Thane said, his sarcasm barely masking his irritation. Half the people in charge around here are shady enough to make a black hole look bright. Zala snorted, her eyes scanning the data with the intensity of a hawk. We need to get this back to the surface, compare it with the official specs. If we can prove someone's tampered with the tech, we might have a case, and if we can't, Thane asked, though he already knew the answer. Then we're royally screwed, Zala replied, not missing a beat. But hey, at least we'll go down swinging. Thane couldn't help but grin at her tenacity. Let's get moving then. The sooner we get this data back, the sooner we can figure out who to trust, or who to avoid, Zala added, her expression serious. One wrong move and we could end up as footnotes in a conspiracy theory. Wouldn't be the first time, Thane muttered, though he felt the weight of her words. They were in deep now, and the only way out was forward. As they retraced their steps, Thane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, as if the shadows themselves had eyes. It was a feeling he'd learned not to ignore. Too often it meant trouble was just around the corner. What's the plan if we run into resistance? Zala asked, her tone deceptively light. Improvise, Thane replied. And hope we're faster than they are. Sounds like a plan, she said with a wry smile. I knew there was a reason I liked working with you. Thane chuckled, though there was little humor in it. They were playing a dangerous game, one with stakes higher than either of them had anticipated. But he trusted Zala, and that was something he didn't give lightly. As they approached the teleportation bay, Thane's senses were on high alert, every instinct honed for the slightest hint of danger. The coordinates might have been their first clue, but they were far from their last. Ready? He asked, his voice steady despite the knot of tension in his gut. Always, Zala replied, her eyes gleaming with determination. Together they activated the system, the familiar hum enveloping them as reality bent and twisted once more. They were far from finished, and the road ahead promised more twists and turns than they could imagine. But one thing was certain, they weren't stopping, not yet. They had a mystery to unravel and truths to uncover, no matter where they led. Thane Asher and Zala Nisk found themselves standing in a dimension that was the intergalactic equivalent of a political powder keg with a lit fuse. The air was thick with tension, and the locals had a fondness for carrying weapons like fashion accessories. It was one of those places where you could practically trip over an assassination plot on your way to buy a loaf of bread. A real paradise. Welcome to Sector 7G. Thane gestured around with a flourish that would have been more at home on a discount tour guide than a man who'd just teleported into potential peril. Not exactly the vacation spot I'd have chosen, but I hear the riots are quite the spectacle. Zala adjusted her pack, her eyes scanning the chaotic marketplace they'd stepped into. Reminds me of that time on Zmarek when we ended up in the middle of a coup. Only smellier. Ah, Zmarek. Where the air was spicy and the bullets spicier, they moved cautiously through the crowd, the locals giving them looks that varied from disinterested to murderous. Thane felt the weight of eyes on his back, as if the universe itself was getting ready for a good laugh at their expense. What are we looking for again? Zala asked, her voice low enough to avoid unwanted attention but loud enough to pierce the constant hum of the marketplace. Evidence, Thane replied. Something to tie this dimension-hopping conspiracy to the mess back at Galaxia Prime, preferably without getting shot or arrested, or both. Good luck with that. This place has more secrets than a politician's diary. The pair ducked into a narrow alleyway, a shortcut through the maze of stalls and shouting vendors. The walls were a patchwork of grime and graffiti, the latter depicting messages in a language neither of them recognized, but could guess was probably rude. Zala pulled out her scanner, a compact device that had seen better days but still managed to perform miracles in her skilled hands. If anyone's messing with the teleport tech here, they'll leave a trace. Just gotta find it sure, because it's not like they'd notice a couple of strangers waving around suspicious tech in their backyard. Thane's sarcasm was as thick as the smog. Relax, Asher, we're blending right in. Zala smirked, her fingers dancing over the scanner's surface. Right. Because nothing says local like being the only two people not carrying a gun bigger than their head. They rounded a corner and nearly collided with a group of what could only be described as low-rent enforcers. The kind that would rough you up for pocket change and might even apologize if they didn't find any. Their leader, a scrawny, rat-faced man with an impressive collection of scars, looked them over with the wary interest of a predator deciding if it was worth the effort. Well, what do we have here? Rat-Face drawled, his voice a nasal whine that grated like nails on a blackboard. Tourists, Thane said, plastering on a smile that felt more like a grimace. We heard the street performances here are to die for. Funny, Rat-Face said, though his expression suggested he'd rather see them in a ditch than on stage. Nobody comes here unless they want something, or they're running from something. Which is it with you? Bit of both, Zala quipped, her eyes scanning the alley for potential escape routes. Rat-Face looked like he wanted to argue, but Thane, ever the diplomat when it suited him, decided to take the direct approach. We're just looking for a friend. Maybe you've seen them. Answers to the name of conspiracy and looks like trouble. We don't like trouble here, Rat-Face replied, though the lie was so blatant it should have been wearing a neon sign. Could have fooled me, Thane murmured. Look, we're not looking for a fight. Just information. The enforcer sneered, but something in Thane's demeanor must have screamed not entirely stupid because Rat-Face relaxed a fraction. Information costs, of course it does. But how about this? If you help us, we'll owe you. And we're very resourceful when it comes to paying debts. Rat-Face seemed to chew this over, his cronies watching with the kind of focus usually reserved for a card game with high stakes. Finally, he nodded. There's a group, calls themselves the Unity Council. They're the ones meddling with tech that doesn't belong to them. You didn't hear it from me, wouldn't dream of it, Zala said, offering a smile that was probably more disarming than intended given their audience. With that, the enforcers melted back into the shadows, leaving Thane and Zala alone once more. Well, that was enlightening, Thane said, rubbing the back of his neck. Unity Council. Sounds like a peaceful bunch, peaceful as a nest of vipers, Zala agreed. But if they are the ones behind the tech tampering, it makes sense. They've got fingers in every pie, dimensionally speaking. Great. So we're up against a secretive, well-connected group with questionable ethics and a penchant for tweaking reality. Sounds like a party. They navigated through the alley, making their way toward the heart of the city where the Unity Council allegedly operated. The buildings grew taller and more oppressive, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow the light. Do you ever get the feeling we're in over our heads? Thane asked, more to himself than Zala. Constantly. But that's why it's fun, right? Yeah, fun. Like juggling plasma grenades. The Unity Council's headquarters was as unassuming as a snake in the grass. No flashy signs, no grand entrances. Just a nondescript building that whispered danger to those who knew how to listen, or were just really unlucky. They approached under the guise of casual indifference, a skill they'd both honed through countless misadventures. The entrance was guarded by a pair of sentries who had the look of people bored enough to start a fight for entertainment. Leave the talking to me, Thane said, adopting a swagger that didn't come naturally but seemed to suit their purposes. Gladly. My people's skills start and end with don't stab first. The sentries eyed them with the kind of suspicion reserved for strangers and suspicious packages. State your business, one of them barked, his hand hovering near his sidearm in a way that suggested he'd used it more than once. Just here to see your boss, Thane said, slipping into the role of a brash outsider with more confidence than sense. Got a business proposal that'll knock their socks off. The sentries exchanged glances, clearly weighing the likelihood of Thane being more trouble than he was worth. Finally, one of them nodded toward the door. Don't cause trouble, and you might leave with all your limbs. Sounds fair, Thane said, offering a mock salute before leading Zala inside. The interior was all sleek metal and cold efficiency, the kind of place designed to make you feel small and insignificant. A receptionist with eyes that could cut glass glanced up from her terminal, her expression one of professional disdain. "How can I help you?" she intoned like she'd rather be anywhere else. "We're here to see someone in charge," Thane said, keeping his tone light. "Have a few questions about some interdimensional tech, and we're hoping to leave before someone decides to shoot us." The receptionist gave them a look that suggested she'd heard worse. "Wait here," she said, before disappearing into a back room with an air of inevitability. "Think she likes us?" Zala asked, leaning against the counter with studied nonchalance. "Definitely. Could probably kill us with a paperclip, though. The wait wasn't long, but it was long enough for Thane to get twitchy. The kind of nervous energy that had seen him through countless close calls and near disasters. When the receptionist returned, she was accompanied by a man who exuded authority and menace in equal measure. "Follow me," the man said, his voice smooth as oil and twice as slippery. They were led into an office that was a shrine to minimalism and power. The man, who introduced himself as Callan, gestured for them to sit. "I hear you have questions." "We do," Thane said, glancing at Zala for a moment before focusing on Callan. "We're investigating some tech anomalies on Galaxia Prime. Your name came up. Interesting. We're just a small council with interests in many places. Why would our name be linked to a backwater like Galaxia?" Zala leaned forward, her eyes locked on Callan like a predator sizing up a rival. "Because someone's been tampering with teleportation hubs, and we have reason to believe it's connected to your operations." Callan's smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You have proof?" "We're working on it," Thane interjected, his voice steady. "And let's be honest, if we had it, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Then perhaps you should leave before you find yourselves in over your heads." Callan's tone was polite, but the threat was as clear as day. Thane weighed their options, which were fewer than he'd like. "We'll take that under advisement. But know this, we're not the only ones interested in what's going on." "Of that I have no doubt," Callan replied smoothly. "But be careful. Curiosity has a way of getting people killed." With that, they were escorted out, the tension between them and Callan crackling like static electricity. Once outside, Zala let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That went well," she said, sarcasm dripping from every word. "Define well," Thane replied as they made their way back through the city. "We still have no solid evidence, and now we're on their radar. Yeah, but we're also not dead. Yet. Call it a win." They navigated the streets with purpose, their thoughts spinning like a roulette wheel on a bad streak. The conspiracy ran deeper than they'd imagined, and the Unity Council was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. "We need to regroup, figure out our next move," Thane said, as they approached the teleportation bay they'd arrived at. "And hope we don't end up jumping into a dimension worse than this one," Zala added, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Optimism, Zala. It's what keeps us alive. Funny, I thought it was sheer dumb luck." With a shared look that spoke volumes of trust and camaraderie, they activated the teleportation system. The familiar hum enveloped them, a reminder that the road ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But that was fine. They'd faced worse odds and lived to tell the tale. And as the world dissolved around them, Thane couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. The game was afoot, and they were far from finished. Thane stepped off the teleport pad with the grace of a cat thrown out of a window, managing to land in a crouch that might have looked cool if it hadn't been followed by a stumble. Zala landed beside him, the transition like butter on a hot skillet, smooth and efficient. "Welcome back to Galaxia Prime," she said, waving her scanner like a magic wand that only did disappointment. "Where the air smells of regret and the locals carry guns like they are handbags." "Charming," Thane replied, shaking off the last of the teleport-induced dizziness. He glanced around the bustling hub, people and creatures of questionable morality moving with the kind of urgency that suggested either desperation or a good sale on black market goods. "So what's the plan?" Zala asked, eyes scanning the crowd for anyone who might be interested in their premature demise. "Same as always. We try to alert the Galactic Council, fail spectacularly, and then figure out how not to get vaporized by lunchtime." Gee, and here I thought we'd do something different today. They made their way through the hub, passing stalls selling everything from dubious food to alien trinkets that probably doubled as explosive devices. The Galactic Council office loomed ahead, a towering edifice of bureaucracy and misplaced hope. Think they've improved their customer service? Zala asked, sidestepping a vendor who was far too eager to sell them something squirming. Doubt it. They've probably added more forms for us to fill out before they ignore us. The office interior was, as they remembered, soulless and sterile, like someone had tried to decorate it with the concept of emptiness. A clerk sat behind a desk, a holographic display flickering with pointless data loops. State your business, the clerk droned, voice as monotone as an engine hum. We'd like to report a dimension-hopping conspiracy, Thane said, trying for professional but landing closer to caffeinated desperation. Involving Gloxia Prime, the clerk didn't even blink. Do you have an appointment? Thane exchanged a glance with Zala, who rolled her eyes in silent solidarity. No, but I think a conspiracy kind of qualifies as a walk-in. Please take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly. The clerk's finger stabbed a button and a pair of seats emerged from the wall, looking about as comfortable as a bed of nails. They sat, and the waiting began. Time stretched out, minutes feeling like hours in the oppressive silence. Zala pulled out a small device from her pocket, tinkering with it to pass the time. You think they'll actually see us? Thane asked, keeping his voice low. Not a chance. But it's the thought that counts, right? Right. Maybe will be the thought that gets them all assassinated. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. A figure walked out, someone familiar that made the hairs on the back of Thane's neck stand at attention. It was Creel, a man who wore the look of a politician who'd sold his soul and got a bad deal. Creel, Thane said, his tone implying that if his life were a game show, Creel would be the booby prize. Didn't expect to see you here. Nor I you, Creel replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. But here we are, small galaxy and all that. Zala studied him, eyes narrowed like she was deciding the best way to skin him with a spoon. You part of this conspiracy too, or just visiting? Visiting, Creel said with a lightness that suggested he was lying. The council's always open to new ideas. Like dimension-hopping sabotage, Creel's expression didn't flicker, a testament to either his poker face or his utter detachment from human emotion. I'm here for more mundane matters. Trade negotiations, you know. Thane wasn't buying it, and neither was Zala if her posture was anything to go by. Well, we're here to report some, let's call them irregularities, regarding the teleportation tech. Heard anything about that? Can't say I have, Creel replied, his words as slippery as a greased eel. But it sounds fascinating. The exchange hung between them like bad weather. Thane's instincts were telling him they were missing something, and it was probably about to bite them in the ass. I'm sure you'll figure it out, Creel added, his smile turning into a smirk that screamed good luck, suckers. If you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend. He walked away and Thane watched him go, feeling like he just had a conversation with a snake that was too lazy to strike but enjoyed the intimidation factor. Well, that was enlightening, Zala remarked, tucking her device away. Think he's involved, probably. But proving it's another matter. We need evidence, something concrete or explosive, Zala said, her tone only half joking. They left the office, the clerk not even acknowledging their departure. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like ghostly fingers. What's our next move? Zala asked as they navigated the crowded streets. We need to hit the underbelly, find someone who knows more than they should, back to dealing with the delightful denizens of Gloxia Prime. Joy. They passed a group of street performers, their act less a performance and more an exercise in avoiding personal injury. Thane watched them, reminded of the chaos they were trying to untangle. Unity Council's got its claws in deep, he said, more to himself than to Zala. And we're running out of allies. Not entirely, Zala replied, a glint of mischief in her eyes. You forget we've got a few contacts who owe us more than they'd like to admit. You mean contacts who would rather see us 6 feet under, she shrugged. Details. They navigated through the district, the buildings leaning in like old drunks with secrets to tell. Their destination was a bar, the kind of place where deals were made and lives were ruined. It was called The Last Chance, a name that seemed both prophetic and a warning. They entered, the dim lighting doing little to hide the air of desperation clinging to the patrons. The bartender looked up, a cyborg with more metal than flesh, his eyes glowing with a soft blue light. "Thane Zala," he said, his voice like gravel being ground underfoot. "To what do I owe the displeasure? We're looking for information," Thane replied, leaning against the bar as if he belonged there. "Information costs, doesn't everything?" Zala chimed in, sliding onto a stool beside Thane. "We're after any whispers about the Unity Council's meddling in teleport tech." The bartender chuckled, a sound akin to a malfunctioning blender. "Dangerous talk, but I might know someone who can help." "Who?" Thane asked, keeping his tone casual but alert. The bartender nodded toward a table in the corner, where a figure was nursing a drink like it was their last friend. "Sark. Bit of a wild card, but he's got ears in places most wouldn't dare stick their noses." "Thanks," Thane said, barely resisting the urge to ask for a drink to dull the edges of reality. "We'll take it from here." They approached Sark, who looked up from his drink with eyes that held the weight of too much knowledge and too little care. He was a man who seemed to exist on the fringes, enjoying the view from the edge. "Sark," Thane began, sliding into the seat opposite. "We need to talk. Talk's cheap, but I'll indulge," Sark replied, his voice a low rumble. "What's the topic?" "Unity Council and their interest in teleport tech." Sark's gaze sharpened, a hint of danger in his smile. "Big topic. They've been stirring things up all right. But you didn't hear it from me, of course," Zala said, leaning back in her chair with a casualness that belied her readiness to bolt or brawl. "What do you know? They're working on something big. Some kind of tech that makes dimension hopping look like a kiddie ride. Rumors say they're planning to destabilize select dimensions, create chaos, then swoop in to fix things." "Why?" Thane asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Power, control, money. The usual suspects." Sark took a swig from his drink, eyes never leaving theirs. "And they're not above cutting a few throats to get there." "Sounds like our kind of party," Zala said with faux enthusiasm. "Any idea who's calling the shots? That's the million-credit question. But if I were you, I'd be wary of Creel. He's got his fingers in more pies than a baker on speed." Thane filed the information away, knowing it was a piece of a much larger puzzle. One that was rapidly becoming more complex and dangerous. "Thanks, Sark. This helps," he said, standing up. "Consider it a friendly warning," Sark replied, his smile a slash of white in the dim light. "They know you're onto them. Watch your backs." They left the bar, the night air cool against their skin, laden with unspoken threats and promises of chaos. Thane's mind was whirring, plans forming and dissolving as quickly as they appeared. "What now?" Zala asked, falling into step beside him. "We lay low, gather more intel, and prepare for the worst." "Optimism at its finest," she said with a dry chuckle. "It's what I'm known for." The streets seemed quieter now, the shadows deeper, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Thane couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the game had turned and they were now the hunted. "Think we'll make it out of this?" Zala asked, her tone half serious, half jest. "Always do," Thane replied, though his thoughts were less certain. "We just have to stay one step ahead, which means we're already 2 steps behind," she quipped. They reached their temporary hideout, a cramped apartment with all the charm of a cell block. Inside, Zala pulled out her scanner, setting it to sweep for bugs or any unwanted surprises. "All clear, for now. Give it a few hours and I'm sure they'll drop by for tea," Thane said, watching her work. "Hope they bring snacks." "I'm starving." They settled in, the room filled with the quiet hum of the scanner and their own restless thoughts. It wasn't the first time they'd found themselves neck-deep in trouble, but this felt different, bigger, with stakes higher than they'd ever faced. "Galactic Council's a dead end," Zala said, breaking the silence. They're either in on it or they just don't care. Probably both, Thane replied. We'll have to find another way. Got any brilliant ideas? Working on it, he said, though his mind was drawing blanks faster than a faulty printer. They sat in silence, each contemplating the road ahead, the risks, the dangers, the unknowns lurking in every corner. It was daunting, but they'd come too far to back down now. Guess we'll have to be our own counsel, Zala said with a rueful smile. Great, Thane replied, grinning despite himself. Can I be the one who takes bribes and never shows up for meetings? Sure, but only if I get to be the one who starts pointless wars. They laughed together, the sound an oasis in the desert of tension that surrounded them. For a moment, the weight of their mission seemed lighter, the path ahead less daunting, but only for a moment. As reality reasserted itself, they knew they were in for the fight of their lives. A fight against shadows and secrets, where every misstep could be their last. And with the Unity Council looming like a storm on the horizon, Thane and Zala would need every ounce of luck and skill they possessed to survive what was to come. Thane Asher and Zala Nisk found themselves in Sector 7G, a place where the air wasn't just spicy, it was downright incendiary. This wasn't a casual trip to the corner store for milk and eggs. They'd been unceremoniously dumped into what felt like the galactic equivalent of a war zone, thanks to the teleportation hub's questionable sense of humor. Such was life when the universe itself seemed to find your suffering entertaining. Well, this is just peachy, Thane muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. The air was thick with the acrid tang of gunpowder, and the occasional pop of gunfire served as an off-key symphony to his misery. Peachy. Zala's voice dripped with sarcasm as she fiddled with her scanner, coaxing it to life like an old dog reluctant to fetch. More like death warmed over. Twice. Thane grunted in agreement. The hub has really outdone itself this time. I can almost hear it laughing. Yeah, well, let's hope it doesn't have a sense of humor about stranding us here permanently. Thane reached for his utility belt, pulling out a small device that looked like a cross between a calculator and a brick. This should help us find a way out, or, explode in our faces. 50-50, really. Odds I can work with, Zala replied. But we need to focus. We're sitting ducks here. They began to move, picking their way through the rubble-strewn streets with the grace of two people who hadn't quite decided if they were running from something or towards it. The cityscape around them was a nightmare of leaning towers and shattered glass, a fitting backdrop for their current predicament. So what's the plan, fearless leader? Zala asked, her tone laced with the kind of respect you reserve for someone who just accidentally locked themselves out of their own spaceship. Plan, right. Step 1, don't die. Step 2, find evidence against the Unity Council. Step 3, profit. Zala rolled her eyes. I'm glad to see you've mapped this out so thoroughly. Hey, I'm a big picture kind of guy, Thane shot back. Details are just things that ruin a good narrative. As they rounded a corner, they stumbled upon a small group of locals who seemed to be doing their best impression of a welcoming committee, complete with guns pointed directly at their heads. Well, if it isn't the local welcoming committee, Thane quipped, raising his hands with exaggerated slowness. Sorry we didn't bring a casserole. The leader of the group, a grizzled man with a face like a used ashtray, sneered. State your business, we're just tourists, Zala said, flashing a smile that could melt steel. Looking for a good time in some local culture. Funny, ashtray face replied, the joke clearly lost on him. This sector doesn't get many tourists, Thane shrugged. Maybe that's because the hospitality sucks. Thankfully, Zala had a bit more finesse. We might be able to help each other out. We're actually here on official business. Very hush-hush, top secret, all that jazz. The man studied them for a moment, weighing his options like a man picking between two equally terrible brands of instant coffee. Top secret, huh? Maybe we can talk somewhere a bit more. Private, they followed him, the other locals forming a loose perimeter around them. It was either the worst guided tour ever or the beginning of a particularly ambitious kidnapping attempt. Either way, Thane and Zala weren't left with many options. Thane leaned toward Zala. You get the feeling today's special is betrayal with a side of bullets. Every day's special around here, she whispered back. I'm just hoping they have decent dessert. Their guide led them into a derelict building, the interior a testament to neglect and whatever the space equivalent of termites was. It was the kind of place that made you itch just by looking at it. Inside, a table was set up with maps and various gadgets that screamed were up to no good. Their host motioned for them to sit, which Thane did with all the enthusiasm of a cat about to be tossed into a bath. So, what's the real story? Ashtray Face asked, folding his arms and fixing them with a glare that could have stripped paint. We're investigating the Unity Council's activities, Thane admitted. They've been dabbling in teleportation tech, causing all sorts of delightful chaos. And you think they're behind the instability here? Think. Zala shot back, her voice a scalpel. We know. Problem is, we don't have much proof. We're working on that. Ashtray Face rubbed his chin, considering their words. I might have something that could help. Assuming you can make it worth my while. Currency's not exactly our strong suit right now, Thane said, scratching the back of his neck. But we're good at solving problems. Messy or otherwise. Messy I like, their host said with a slow nod. There's a group stirring up trouble in the area. Deal with them and I'll give you the info you need. Sounds like a fair trade, Zala said, eyeing the maps on the table. We'll take care of it. With the deal struck, Thane and Zala were back on the streets, now with a purpose that didn't involve getting shot at, though that was always a possibility. They followed the directions scribbled on a piece of paper that looked like it had been used as a napkin more than once. Think we're biting off more than we can chew? Thane asked as they picked their way through the debris. Isn't that our default setting? Zala replied, her eyes scanning for any sign of their targets. Thane chuckled despite himself. I suppose it is. Besides, when has a little light treason ever stopped us? They reached the designated location, a dilapidated warehouse that loomed like a hulking beast in the shadows. The air was thick with tension and the promise of violence, a cocktail Thane had grown far too accustomed to. Ready? He asked, glancing at Zala. Always, she replied, drawing her weapon with a professionalism that belied the chaos they were about to dive into. They burst through the door, weapons drawn, hearts pounding like they were in the worst drum circle ever conceived. Inside, the place was a hive of activity, if wasps carried guns and had a penchant for organized crime. Evening, gentlemen, Thane announced, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. We're here to discuss your problematic presence in the neighborhood. The reception was about what they expected. A flurry of movement, followed by the sound of guns being cocked and safety catches being flipped off. Thane ducked behind a crate, the sharp smell of cordite filling the air as the first shots rang out. Subtle as always, Zala muttered, taking cover beside him. Subtlety's overrated, Thane replied, popping up to return fire. Besides, I thought you liked fireworks. The firefight was short, brutal, and entirely lacking in the kind of finesse that their instructors would have approved of. But it got the job done. As the dust settled, Thane and Zala made their way through the wreckage, ensuring that their handiwork was complete. Think that's all of them? Zala asked, nudging a fallen adversary with her boot. Here's hoping, Thane replied, checking his weapon. Let's find what we came for and get out. They searched the place, coming across a terminal that looked promisingly out of place amidst the chaos. Zala set to work, her fingers dancing over the console with the practiced ease of someone who spent too much time inside the minds of machines. Got it, she said, her eyes still glued to the screen. Files on Unity Council's operations, everything we need to nail these bastards to the wall. Let's grab it and go, Thane said, already moving toward the exit. Before someone decides to crash the party, they made their escape, the data safely downloaded and tucked away. The streets were emptier now, as if even Sector 7G knew when to call it a night. They moved quickly, adrenaline still singing in their veins like an off-key choir. Feeling optimistic, Thane asked as they neared their makeshift hideout. Like a ray of sunshine, Zala replied with a smirk. We might just pull this off, famous last words. Inside their cramped, dingy abode, Zala connected the device to their terminal, bringing up the data they'd risked their necks for. The screen filled with files, documents, and video feeds, enough evidence to make any Galactic Council member choke on their breakfast. "Now we just need to get this to the right people," Thane said, sinking into a chair with a groan. "Assuming there are any right people left," Zala added darkly. But yeah, it's a start. They sat there surrounded by the quiet hum of electronics, the weight of their task settling on them like a heavy cloak. They were in deeper than they'd ever been before, but this was the nature of their lives. "So what's next?" Zala asked, breaking the silence. "Next we plan," Thane replied, rubbing his temples. "We find the cracks in the Unity Council's armor and shove this evidence right into them. It's going to be a hell of a fight," she said, though her voice held a note of anticipation that suggested she wouldn't have it any other way. "That's what we signed up for," Thane said, smiling despite the odds stacked against them. "Now let's make sure we come out the other side with all our limbs intact." They spent the rest of the night going through the data, piecing together the puzzle of the Unity Council's plans, their strengths, and their weaknesses. It was like trying to untangle a ball of barbed wire, but every small victory, every new piece of information, brought them one step closer to their goal. As dawn broke, casting a sullen light over the city, Thane felt a flicker of something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Hope that they could do this. Hope that they could dismantle the conspiracy and walk away with their lives. "Ready to save the universe again?" Zala asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Always," Thane replied, his voice steady, his resolve firm. In the grim reality of a universe filled with shadows, they would be the torchbearers, lighting the way forward with bullets and bravado. And maybe, just maybe, they'd live to tell the tale. Thane Asher sat in their dingy hideout, surrounded by a litany of screens glowing like the world's worst Christmas display. He idly flicked through the data they'd secured, most of which was as exciting as a tax return. Yet somewhere buried within the digital drudgery was the key to toppling the Unity Council. He took a sip of whatever passed for coffee in this part of the universe, a concoction strong enough to make engine oil seem like a delightful alternative. "Who knew saving the universe involved so much paperwork?" Thane muttered, rubbing his eyes. Zala, having meticulously combed through the data for hours, finally let out a triumphant noise. "Got something," she declared, pointing at a series of schematics that screamed bad idea louder than a spacewalk without a helmet. "What am I looking at?" Thane asked, squinting at the chaotic display. "These are the blueprints for the dimension-hopping tech the Council's been playing with," Zala said, her finger tracing the convoluted lines. "And here's the juicy bit, it has a flaw." Thane raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. It's unstable enough to make a black hole look like a kiddie pool." "Something like that," Zala confirmed. "There's a vulnerability in the teleportation matrix that could be exploited. Push the right buttons and we could make their whole operation go kablooey. Technical term, is it?" "Shut up. The point is, if we pull this off, the Council's dirty laundry gets aired out for the whole galaxy to see." Thane grinned, an expression that was more wolf than man. "Sounds like we're back in business." But just as he started to savor the prospect of a little well-earned chaos, the door to their hideout burst open with all the subtlety of a meteor strike. A group of heavily armed thugs stormed in, weapons ready, faces set to permanent scowl. "Guess they didn't appreciate our fireworks," Thane muttered under his breath, raising his hands. Zala shot him a glare that said "I told you so" without needing to say a word. They'd been made, and the universe, in all its infinite wisdom, decided to find their suffering particularly entertaining today. "Thane Asher and Zala Nisk," bellowed a muscle-bound goon who looked like he'd failed his audition for a cyborg action movie. "You're coming with us." Thane chuckled, though his humor was more gallows than gallant. "What, no dinner first?" Zala, ever the pragmatist, eyed the situation with the cool calculation of someone who'd once defused a bomb while arguing with a telemarketer. "What do you want?" "Orders," the goon grunted. You two are valuable alive, so don't try anything stupid. Stupid's kinda our specialty, Thane quipped, earning him a solid, if unnecessary, shove towards the door. They were marched out into the streets, a procession of unluckiness heading toward an uncertain fate. Thane's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan even as his situation spiraled further into the galactic commode. "Got any bright ideas?" he whispered to Zala, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "I'm working on it," she replied tersely. "But if you've got an ace up your sleeve, now might be a good time." Their captors led them to an industrial section of Sector 7G, where the air had an odor reminiscent of hot metal and despair. They were herded into a warehouse that looked like it had seen better days, a claim that could also apply to Thane and Zala. Inside, the thugs kept them under watch while their leader, a man whose face could curdle milk, appeared with a self-satisfied smirk. "You've been causing us quite a headache," he said, as if discussing the weather. "But that ends now." Zala rolled her eyes. "Let me guess you're going to monologue how you're going to ruin us, then leave us in an easily escapable situation." The leader chuckled, though it was devoid of mirth. "Hardly you're going to help us, or she dies." As if on cue, two enforcers grabbed Zala, dragging her toward a side room. Thane's heart plummeted like a rock in zero gravity, the gravity of the situation hitting him square in the gut. "No," he shouted, moving to intervene but finding himself restrained by a pair of burly guards. "Let her go," the leader shrugged like a man discussing the price of potatoes. "I'm not unreasonable, we just need a little assurance." Zala glanced back, eyes calm and defiant even as she was led away. "Don't do anything stupid, Thane," she said with a smirk, though the words were heavy with unspoken meaning. Left alone with his captors, Thane felt the full weight of his predicament settle on his shoulders like an unwanted cloak. He was seemingly alone now, his closest ally taken, and the universe continued to watch with gleeful malice. Time dragged like a broken limb, each second a testament to the precarious tightrope they walked. Thane's mind circled the problem, looking for an angle, an opportunity, a way to turn the tables. "Ever think you were born under a bad sign?" Thane asked the guard nearest him, who responded with the enthusiasm of a brick. "No, just me then." With Zala out of the picture, temporarily he hoped, Thane had to act, and soon. He replayed the schematics Zala had shown him, searching for a way to use the dimensional tech's flaw to their advantage. The guards, assuming he was as harmless as a declawed cat, paid little attention as Thane began to fidget with his utility belt. They didn't notice the small device he managed to palm, a gift from Zala during one of their less disastrous escapades, a little something she called the problem solver. As the guards continued their vigilant boredom, Thane surreptitiously activated the device, watching with satisfaction as it powered up, ready to stir the pot. He just hoped it didn't blow them all sky high in the process. "Time to make some noise," Thane whispered to himself, then louder to the guards. "Hey, you might want to take cover." The guards exchanged confused glances, just as the device emitted a low hum that crescendoed into a blinding flash of light and a concussive wave that sent them sprawling like bowling pins. In the chaos, Thane made his move, scrambling for the exit with the grace of a caffeinated scourge. He had to find Zala, and fast, before their captors regrouped and realized just how much they'd underestimated him. The warehouse was a labyrinth of crates and shadows, but Thane navigated it with the deftness of someone who'd spent far too much time in places just like this. He found the room where Zala was held, guarded by a pair of thugs who, judging by their vacant expressions, were clearly hired for muscle, not brains. Thane's entrance was anything but subtle, but subtlety was never his forte. He tackled the first guard with a ferocity born of desperation, the two of them crashing into a pile of metal containers with a clatter that echoed like a particularly aggressive band practice. "Thane," Zala called, her voice a mix of relief and exasperation as she fought against her restraints. He was too busy dodging the second guard's meaty fist to respond, But the fight was quickly decided when Thane, half by accident, sent the guard stumbling into a stack of precariously balanced crates. The resulting avalanche was enough to put any further resistance to bed. Breathing hard, Thane freed Zala, who rubbed her wrists and shot him a sardonic grin. "Took your sweet time. Had to stop for a latte," Thane replied, helping her to her feet. "Let's get out of here before they figure out what hit him." They slipped through the chaos, both of them moving with the urgency of people who had no intention of becoming permanent residents of the sector's prison system. The city outside was as hostile as ever, but now it was a kind of hostility they could work with. "We've still got the data," Zala said, checking the small device she carried. "If we can get to a terminal, we can broadcast it and blow this whole thing wide open." Thane nodded, his mind already working on their next move. "Then let's make some headlines." The streets were a blur of neon and shadow as they ran, ducking into alleys and moving with the kind of purpose that only desperation could inspire. They found a terminal in a semi-abandoned communications hub, a relic of a more optimistic age that now served as their lifeline. Zala connected the device, her fingers flying over the keyboard with the kind of precision usually reserved for brain surgery. Thane kept watch, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. They were burning daylight they didn't have, and the clock was ticking down faster than ever. "How long?" Thane asked, glancing over his shoulder. 2 minutes, Zala replied, her focus unbroken. "Just keep them off my back." The universe, in its infinite wisdom, decided that now was the perfect time to throw a wrench in the works. The first wave of reinforcements arrived, and Thane found himself confronted by more hired thugs than he cared to count. "Figures," he muttered, drawing his weapon with a resigned sigh. Always a catch. A firefight erupted, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire and shouted orders. Thane ducked and weaved, returning fire with the grim determination of a man with nothing left to lose. Each shot bought them a few precious seconds, but the odds were stacking up against them faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. "Almost there," Zala called, her voice a lifeline amid the chaos. Thane's world narrowed to the immediate, the here and now, every instinct focused on keeping the enemy at bay. He was running on adrenaline, luck, and sheer bloody-mindedness, and he just needed to hold on a little longer. "Done," Zala shouted, disconnecting the device with a flourish. "Let's get the hell out of here." They bolted, leaving the terminal behind like a bad memory. The data was out there now, a digital time bomb set to explode across the networks, exposing the Unity Council's dirty secrets to the universe at large. "Think we made it?" Thane asked, as they ducked into yet another alley, their pursuers momentarily lost in the labyrinthine streets. "Depends," Zala replied, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "On whether you think they'll kill us before or after the news breaks." Thane grinned, a wild, reckless thing that held more defiance than hope. "Guess we'll find out soon enough." And as they disappeared into the city's underbelly, the promise of retribution hot on their heels, Thane couldn't help but feel a flicker of something close to optimism. They'd taken a shot in the dark, and for better or worse, the universe was about to find out just what kind of mess they'd stirred up. The city buzzed like a hive gone mad, every corner, every shadow, holding a potential threat. Thane and Zala threaded their way through Sector 7G's back alleys, their footsteps muffled by the relentless cacophony. It was a place that could chew you up and spit you out quicker than you could say galactic gentrification. Thane checked their six, no sign of their pursuers so far. "You know, I'd always hoped my life would end with a big explosion, but I was thinking more along the lines of a heroic sacrifice, not being vaporized by a bunch of goons with delusions of adequacy." Zala smirked, shaking her head. "If we die, I'm haunting you." "Join the queue," Thane replied. His utility belt clanged with gadgets, the sound a constant reminder of their plan, a plan as unstable as a junkie on payday. The atmosphere was thick with the metallic tinge of desperation, that familiar scent that clings to places where dreams go to die. Gloxia Prime, with its gun-toting fashionistas and regulations more flexible than a contortionist on a sugar high, had been bad enough. But Sector 7G, it was the kind of place that made you long for the relative safety of a supernova. Thane and Zala slipped into an abandoned transport station. The teleportation hub sat in the corner, looking as trustworthy as a politician during election season. It was the same hub that had unceremoniously dumped them into this mess earlier, and now it was their ticket out. Zala knelt by the console, her fingers dancing over the keys like she was playing an alien piano. "You sure this is going to work?" Thane shrugged, trying to exude a confidence he didn't feel. "It's either that or we become extremely well-done space toast." "Great," Zala muttered. "Because I'm really in the mood for a gamble with life-or-death stakes. Think of it as an adventure, with potentially lethal consequences." Zala rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile there. "Right, and remind me why I put up with your brand of optimism." Thane's grin was as lopsided as ever. "Because it's contagious." The teleportation hub's console flickered to life, its screen filled with encrypted messages and a jumble of data that might as well have been from a language only spoken by hyper-intelligent squid. Zala's fingers moved faster, finding the cracks in the code that the Unity Council's engineers hadn't bothered to seal. "Here goes nothing," Zala said, taking a deep breath. She initiated the sequence, the hub's machinery whirring with a hum that suggested imminent disaster. The plan was simple, in the way that launching yourself out of an airlock without a suit was simple. They would leverage the hub's dimensional glitch, broadcasting the incriminating data across realms, theoretically getting the attention of the Galactic Council and maybe, just maybe, saving their skins in the process. "I've always wanted to be famous," Thane said, leaning against the console. "Not quite how I imagined it, though." "Yeah, well, I'm hoping for infamy over posthumous fame," Zala retorted, her eyes glued to the screen. "But beggars and choosers, right?" The machinery roared to life, the vibrations coursing through the floor like a prelude to an earthquake. The teleportation hub flashed, a surge of energy that made the hairs on Thane's arms stand on end. "Hold on to your butts," Thane muttered, stealing the line from an old movie he vaguely remembered. It felt appropriate as reality seemed to fold in on itself, the world contorting like a drunken acrobat. For a moment, everything was silence. Thane could hear his own heartbeat, a rapid tattoo in his ears. Then the world snapped back, the teleportation hub spitting them out into a new locale with all the grace of a malfunctioning toaster. They landed on their knees in a dimly lit room, the air stale and heavy with the scent of bureaucracy. Galactic Council headquarters, the heart of the soulless machine, assuming they hadn't been atomized and this wasn't some existential afterlife for the particularly sarcastic. "Well, that was different," Zala said, standing and dusting herself off. Her calm demeanor was reminiscent of someone who just stepped off a pleasant elevator ride, not a cosmic journey through the fabric of space-time. Thane looked around, taking in the sterile environment. The Galactic Council's office was an edifice of misplaced aspirations, a place where hope went to die and paperwork lived forever. They hadn't been immediately vaporized, which Thane took as a win, but convincing the bureaucrats to take action. That was a different beast altogether, like trying to teach a rock to sing opera. "So, do we just knock on the door and say, 'Hey, your dimension-hopping tech has got more holes than a sieve, and your council's dirtier than a pig in a mud bath?'" Thane asked, his sarcasm dialed up to 11. Zala checked the device she'd rigged, its screen displaying the information they'd risked life and limb to obtain. "Something like that, only more polite." "Right, polite," Thane snorted, "because that works so well when you're trying to topple a galactic conspiracy." They moved through the labyrinthine halls, Zala leading the way while Thane kept an eye out for trouble, a task akin to watching the horizon for an incoming tidal wave. When they finally reached the council chamber, it was as if they'd stumbled into some cosmic version of a waiting room, complete with uncomfortable chairs and a clerk with the personality of a damp rag. The clerk looked up, unimpressed by their arrival. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, his voice dripping with bureaucracy. Thane flashed his best smile, the kind that usually got him out of bar fights. "We have something better, evidence of a conspiracy that could sink your whole operation." The clerk didn't even blink. "Take a number." Zala leaned over the counter, her smile as sharp as a knife. "Or we could just broadcast this to every corner of the galaxy and see how that plays out for your bosses." That got his attention. The clerk's expression shifted from bored to mildly interested, a Herculean feat in this place. "Wait here." He disappeared into the back, leaving Thane and Zala to twiddle their thumbs. Thane leaned against the wall, tapping his foot with impatience. "Think we'll actually get a meeting, or are they just going to throw us out the airlock?" Zala shrugged, her eyes scanning the chamber's stale decor. "Guess it depends on how much they care about keeping their cushy jobs." Minutes ticked by, each one dragging like a particularly stubborn mule. Then a door opened, and a figure emerged, one who carried themselves with the weary authority of someone who'd seen it all and was tired of the view. "You claim to have evidence against the Unity Council?" the figure asked, their voice as dry as the paperwork they seemed to live for. Thane nodded, stepping forward. "That's right. And unless you want this to be tomorrow's headlines, you'll want to see it." With a nod from Zala, Thane handed over the device. The official plugged it into a console, the room's holographic display flickering to life with data that painted a damning picture of the Unity Council's activities. The official's eyes widened slightly, the closest thing to shock Thane had seen on anyone working in this building. This is serious." "No kidding," Zala replied, crossing her arms. "And it's going to get out there one way or another." For a moment, the air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes either a breakthrough or a breakdown. Then the official spoke, their tone measured. "I'll see that this reaches the appropriate channels. But you realize this isn't going to be easy. The Unity Council won't go down without a fight." Thane grinned, that reckless, defiant grin that said he was ready for whatever came next. "Wouldn't have it any other way." As they left the chamber, the weight of the past few days pressing down on them like a smothering blanket, Thane felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd thrown a spanner in the works big enough to matter. The clerk at the entrance gave them a nod that might have been respect, or just gas, as they departed. Thane and Zala stepped back into the city, the chaos of Sector 7G waiting to swallow them up once more. "So, what now?" Zala asked, her breath visible in the cool air. "Now we wait," Thane replied, "and hope that this time the universe decides to cut us some slack." They walked away, two figures against the night, their path uncertain but their resolve unbroken. The universe wasn't going to make it easy for them, but that was fine. They'd gotten used to playing the game on hard mode. And as they disappeared into the shadows, the distant hum of the city, their only companion, Thane couldn't help but laugh. Because for the first time in a long time, it felt like they might actually have a chance. The universe, in its eternal quest to make Thane Asher's life as uncomfortable as possible, hadn't yet thrown a meteor at him, but it wasn't for lack of trying. As he and Zala stepped out of the Galactic Council headquarters, they were blindsided by a throng of reporters, their holographic recorders buzzing like mechanical hornets. "So this is what it feels like to be famous," Thane muttered, shielding his eyes from the blinding flashes. "More like infamous," Zala replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure our faces are plastered all over Sector 7G. Most Wanted has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" "Hey, at least they'll remember us," Thane quipped, flashing a grin at a drone that hovered a little too close. "Smile for the camera, partner. We're heroes now." The word heroes felt awkward, like a suit that didn't quite fit. Sure, they'd managed to expose a conspiracy that made the Unity Council look as corrupt as a tin-pot dictator's piggy bank, but they'd also caused a galactic uproar that would take years to untangle. Some might call that reckless. Thane preferred the term courageously stupid. A reporter shoved a microphone in his face, nearly taking out an eye in the process. "Mr. Asher, what's your next move now that you've brought down such a powerful organization?" Thane shrugged, nonchalant as ever. "Oh, start a gardening club, maybe take up knitting. I've heard it's very therapeutic." Zala chuckled beside him, her eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk. "First, maybe we fix that teleportation hub before it decides to start its own intergalactic reality TV show. Teleportation mishaps and where they leave you has potential, but we've got to draw the line somewhere." With a bit of shoving and the kind of verbal gymnastics that would make a diplomat proud, they managed to extricate themselves from the crowd and make their way back to the hideout. It had all the charm of a prison cell, but it was home, or at least the closest thing they had. The screens in the cluttered room flickered with news reports, the faces of Galactic Council members looking appropriately chastised. "Revelation of the century," one headline screamed. "Dimensional scandal exposed," proclaimed another. Thane plopped down in his chair, the springs creaking ominously. "Well, we did it. Brought the big bad wolves to their knees." "Yeah," Zala said, still standing, her expression torn between pride and disbelief. "Guess we're the champions of justice now. Or the idiots who turned the universe upside down," Thane countered, putting his feet up on the console. "Depends on who you ask." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of their actions settling over them like a thick fog. It was a heady thing, knowing they'd managed to change the course of history, but in the glow of the screens it also seemed oddly anticlimactic. Zala finally broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "So, what do we do now? I mean, after the knitting and gardening, of course." Thane sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, first we make sure the teleportation hub stops acting like a cranky toddler. Otherwise, the next group of rebels might end up teleported into the sun." Zala smirked. "That would make for an interesting obituary." "Yeah, heroes of the galaxy, death by incineration. Not exactly the legacy I'm shooting for," Thane replied dryly. "And then we see what kind of mess we've left behind and try to clean it up." The idea of cleaning up felt as appealing as wrestling a space kraken, but it was the right thing to do. And as much as they both hated to admit it, the universe didn't run on heroics and witty banter alone. In the days that followed, Thane and Zala became fixtures at the teleportation hub, their presence as constant as the grime on its walls. The place still looked as trustworthy as a used spaceship dealer, but they were determined to iron out its kinks before someone got scrambled into atoms. They pored over the console's code, the lines of data a blur of numbers and symbols that seemed more confusing than a drunken alien's love letter. "Who the hell wrote this?" Thane muttered, squinting at the screen. "It's like a squirrel got drunk and ran across the keyboard." "Probably some overpaid engineer with a penchant for chaos," Zala replied, her fingers dancing over the keys. "But with a little luck and a lot of caffeine, we'll have this thing running smoother than a politician's excuses." True to her word, Zala's tech wizardry slowly unraveled the mess. They patched the glitches, sealed the leaks, and even managed to install a rudimentary safety system. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than the death trap it had been. One evening, as they sat surrounded by the hub's softly humming machinery, Thane leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. We might actually pull this off. A functional teleportation hub in a universe that's slightly less likely to implode. I'd call that a win." Zala chuckled, brushing a stray hair from her face. "A small one, maybe. But it's a start." Thane nodded, the weight of their success settling in. "And who knows, maybe this time the universe will actually give us a break." "Don't count on it," Zala replied with a grin. "But if it doesn't, at least we've got a head start." They shared a rare moment of quiet triumph, the hub's gentle hum their only company. It was strange, this feeling of accomplishment amidst the chaos, but they embraced it, knowing they'd earned it. Within weeks, the Galactic Council began to implement changes, the fallout from the conspiracy forcing them to reassess their priorities. Dimensional travel was suspended until the technology could be made foolproof, and the Unity Council was no more than a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when power went unchecked. As for Thane and Zala, They were hailed as heroes, though the term still felt foreign on their tongues. They found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of attention, their faces gracing news broadcasts and public forums. Invitations to speak and consult poured in, as if the universe had finally decided to acknowledge their existence in a positive light. "So this is what it feels like to be appreciated," Thane mused one day, flipping through a stack of messages. "I could get used to this." "Don't let it go to your head," Zala warned, scrolling through her own datapad. "We may be the flavor of the month now, but people have short memories." "True," Thane conceded, leaning back in his chair. "But for once, it feels like the universe might actually be on our side." Their fame brought opportunities, and with it, the chance to influence change on a scale they'd never imagined. They threw themselves into their work with a fervor, determined to ensure that the mistakes of the past weren't repeated. Meetings with engineers, scientists, and officials became the norm, their days filled with debates over safety protocols, ethical standards, and the future of interdimensional travel. It was exhausting, but in a good way, the kind of exhaustion that came from knowing you were making a difference. One evening, as they sat in their dingy hideout amidst the clutter of their efforts, Thane looked over at Zala, a wry smile playing on his lips. "You know, for a couple of nobodies from Sector 7G, we've done all right." Zala snorted, shaking her head. "Speak for yourself. I'm still waiting for my mansion and personal robot butler." "Keep dreaming," Thane replied, chuckling. "But seriously, we've come a long way from running for our lives through back alleys." "Yeah," Zala agreed, her gaze thoughtful. "And who knows, maybe we've even managed to make the universe a little less terrible." Thane raised an imaginary glass, his voice solemn. "To a less terrible universe and the fools who dared to dream it." Zala mirrored the gesture, her expression softening. "To us, the unlikely heroes." They clinked their imaginary glasses, a moment of camaraderie that transcended the chaos they'd endured. It was a moment that encapsulated everything they'd fought for, a future where hope wasn't just a distant dream, but a tangible reality. As they turned their attention back to their work, the shadows of their past receding into memory, they knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be new challenges, new adventures, and new opportunities to prove themselves. But for now, they were content to revel in their hard-won success, knowing that they'd achieved something remarkable. They defied the odds, challenged the status quo, and emerged triumphant, their bond stronger than ever. And as they immersed themselves in their plans, the hum of the teleportation hub a comforting presence in the background, they realized that they'd found something more valuable than fame or fortune: purpose. And perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.